Hi, Bill Boggs here. I hope you had a good weekend, and we really have a special treat for you today on our midday conversation with a great gentleman, an unbelievably prolific writer of 262 books, a brilliant scientist. Dr. Isaac Asimov is our guest today, so stay with us.
Midday with Bill Boggs is the New York area Emmy Award winner for Outstanding Discussion Interview Series.
Again, welcome to Midday, and believe me, this is as much a treat for me as I hope it will be for you. When I sit down and talk to Isaac Asimov, I am in a place called awe. I am truly in awe of this gentleman. I'll tell you about him. Many people know of Isaac Asimov as one of, if not the greatest science fiction writer of all time. He is beyond that an enormously popular and brilliant scientist who has the ability to explain complicated things in very clear and concise terms. He is the author of 262 books. Some people don't even read 262 books in their lifetime on subjects ranging from the Bible, Shakespeare, mathematics, obviously great science fiction. Now, he has a new book out, which I'm proud to say, because I really love this gentleman, is, as of yesterday, hit the New York Times bestseller list. And for all of his 261 books, this is the first one to make it on the New York Times bestseller list in its current first publication. It is called Foundation's Edge. It's the fourth novel in the Foundation series. And here to talk about that and almost any subject that you can imagine is Isaac Asimov. Welcome and thank you.
How are you, Bill?
I'm in awe. I've already mentioned that. Foundation's Edge, New York Times bestseller list. How is this making you feel?
Well, as a matter of fact, it's like a second birth. I remember how I felt when I first sold a story back in 1938.
The first one?
First one, instantly. You know, even if I had never sold another story, I would be a writer. And I suddenly felt a kind of brotherhood or siblinghood to all other writers. And this continued for 44 years. Now I'm suddenly a best-selling writer. I've got a bestseller. And I now, once again, feel a sudden kinship to other writers who do bestsellers. You know, my pals.
You're going to hang around with those buddies now. Well, I'm curious as to what brought the great science fiction writer Isaac Asimov back to the novel of science fiction after an absence of 10 years. Why did you decide to come back and write this eagerly anticipated book, Foundation's Edge?
I didn't. I mean, Foundation Trilogy was finished back in 1950, and then they put out the 3 books of it in 51, 52, and 53, and that was it. I went on to other things.
Yeah.
And then Doubleday, well, the fans, the readers, insisted on getting more, and I kept ignoring it. And then Doubleday felt that it might be a good idea, and I ignored them too. And finally, after 32 years, Doubleday got tired of being ignored, and they called me in and grabbed me by the throat and said, "You're going to write another novel." And by that we mean another Foundation novel. And I said, "Oh, all right, okay." And then they put the contract on, and they gave me a huge advance. And I said, "That's too much." And they said, "Shut up and sign."
Shut up and write.
Right. And so I reported them to the Authors League for being impolite to an author. But I got no sympathy. And I wrote it. And I was afraid all the time that everyone would say, "See, he doesn't have the touch anymore. Give us back the advance."
See, now, people wouldn't think that Isaac Asimov would have that kind of insecurity. I mean, with a wide range of subjects, you're acknowledged genius, but you actually did feel a little bit of trepidation about returning to the forum, getting back into the ring, where you've been so successful.
Saying a little bit is, I felt a lot of trepidation. Yeah? I mean, how did I know? I'd written the Foundation Trilogy when I was in my 20s, and now I'm a little past that, and I wasn't sure I could still do it. I mean, maybe I had passed my peak. And anyway, when I brought in the manuscript, my editor said, "No, I'm mad. You should have done this decades ago." And just took off.
As I like to do with any author of fiction on the program, I'd like to give you the latitude of telling our viewers as much as you want to tell about the subject of the book. I don't want to sit down and go through the whole story because I want people to buy it and read it. But loosely, how does it follow the Foundation trilogy, Foundation's Edge?
Well, the Foundation trilogy in general deals with the fall of the galactic empire and the projected rise of a second galactic empire under the guidance of a science called psychohistory. In other words, you treat masses of human beings as though their actions could be predicted.
Behavior becomes mathematical.
That's right, for a lot of people, not for
right.
individuals. And in the Foundation trilogy itself, I described a number of crises, and things looked as though they were going to break up, and then there was a recovery, and there seemed to be smooth sailing. And in Foundation's Edge, I take up the story from there, 498 years after the beginning of the trilogy, introduce new problems, new dangers, and new resolutions. Actually, the entire series, including Foundation's Edge, is a kind of tale of interstellar intrigue and adventure. It's a piece of historical fiction of the future, written as though you were still further in the future, looking back. And there's sweeps of time. I mean, sometimes between items 100 years might pass. And it all has to be kept consistent. And it isn't easy. I mean, I can think of a lot easier things to write than Foundation novels, but Doubleday has no pity.
Well, a lot of what you've written that I've read, the Shakespeare book, the book about the Bible, are products of copious and excellent research on your part. And I envision you sitting in your apartment at your typewriter, your word processor, right? I know you have 3 typewriters going at all times, with the material out, the research out, and seeing you put it together. I don't, and I can't see you writing the science fiction. What is different about the process? Do you lie on a couch and envision it, or are you still just sitting at the typewriter seeing it?
I'm still just sitting at the typewriter, except that I'm not doing any research. I'm making it all up out of my head. And I don't know exactly when I make it up, because while I'm typing, it's just coming out very easily, and I'm reading it with great interest and wondering what's going to happen next. I presume that my unconscious keeps at work under such conditions when I'm wasting time, like when I'm sleeping or eating or shaving or...
That something's going on in your unconscious?
I presume.
I'd like to talk a little bit about your work habits. Any individual who's had this enormous outpouring of work, 262 books, I think we can learn in a lot from it. What do you get up early in the morning? Do you work an 8-hour day? How do you organize yourself to turn out such a great volume?
Well, I do wake up early in the morning. 6 a.m. is my rising hour. I work whenever I'm not doing anything else. That's what it amounts to. I don't have fixed hours. I don't drive myself. It's just when I'm not doing anything else, I'm writing. And I don't like to do anything else.
But some people, some writers, you know, attach a kind of a mysticism about writing. They have to, you know, be in the same place at the same time in a certain mood. There can be no interruptions. I don't see you that way. I see you as just being able to sit down and it's like turning on the light and you go. Am I correct in that?
Yes, when I take a vacation, never voluntarily, I bring paper and pen with me. And when no one is looking, I can sit down and write paper and pen. It comes out just as though I'm working my typewriter, except I can only do fiction. So I generally write short stories when I'm on my vacation.
You've written some great ones. Let me take a pause for a commercial. We have a few very interesting phone calls, and we're going to get into outer space, inner space, the oceans, and a lot of other places today with our special guest, Dr. Isaac Asimov. We'll be right back.
Without anything.
Isaac Asimov, Dr. Isaac Asimov, if you will, Foundation's Edge, the 4th novel in the Foundation series, available. Isaac, just a few things. I know you a little bit better than perhaps I know some of my other guests. We've known each other since 1970. So there are things about you that I think that the average person would be fascinating to know. For example, you are a veritable unending well supply of jokes. At a party, at a dinner party, this man, he could bury the best of them. You are one of those individuals who can remember jokes, right?
Yes.
Let's have a few jokes.
Oh, dear me.
Now, I wouldn't say that to a comedian, Isaac. What's just one recent one that you've heard?
Well,
none of this is planned out.
Yes, yes. Now, you see, there'd be no difficulty. Now I have to think of a joke that isn't in bad taste, that isn't, that you shouldn't have trouble telling.
Because of being on television?
Because of being on television, and, but let me see. All of a sudden, the only ones I can think
we can
of
get to jokes later.
Taste.
We can get to jokes later. But the subconscious will work it out at any point during the program.
If I think of a
joke, will come out.
Which I think I can tell, I will.
All right. Now, another thing that you are famous for is being invited to speak and not having anything prepared, and on the way to the lectern saying, "What do you want me to talk about?" Going up and standing behind the lectern and speaking, correct?
Well, once I was supposed to give a talk, and I had thought of something to say, and the fellow introducing me read an short excerpt from it, you see. Sometimes I say, and this is just very cynically, and that behind every rich elderly woman who wants to freeze herself and come back is a hard-eyed daughter-in-law determined that will never happen.
He's going to defrost her before too much time passes. What do you think New York City will be like in 100 years?
Well, if we're lucky.
Yeah, if we're lucky.
Yes.
If we've not been nuked.
Right. If we're lucky, I'm hoping that New York City and all other cities on Earth will be largely decentralized. In other words, that the urban culture will have passed, that the population of Earth will be lower than it is now, partly through a lower birth rate, partly because people will be moving out into space, and that it will be more spread out, that with the new techniques of communication and transportation, it will no longer be necessary for human beings to all cluster together in one thick clump, so that cities will be smaller, lower, and at the same time, more advanced than they are now.
What do you envision in the area of telecommunications and communications in general about 100 years from now?
Well, I would like to think that we are going to have what we have now, the communication satellites, the computers, but as an integral part of human society in every way, so that each individual person can reach any other person at will, and portably so. In other words, you have some small gadget on you at all times, and by adjusting some call number or other, you can reach anyone anywhere. And for that matter, if you're ever lost, you can set up on your own private wavelength, and everyone will have his own wavelength, and a day when you have laserized communication satellites, you set up a call number. Not only will people know it's you, but they'll know where you are, and they'll come and get you. I've often thought that children, for instance, might have a little communication device that is always going, so that they can't get lost. Parents always know where they are, and then I figure there'll always be a built-in fight in the family, because an age will be reached when the youngster thinks he doesn't have to be on call anymore, and the parents think he still ought to be on call. And you will get these little devices broken, things like that.
It'll be a case of it's 10 p.m. and I know exactly where you are.
Yes, whereas the kid wants to know it's 10 p.m., but you don't have to know where I am. I don't want you to know where I am.
Isaac, do you have any personal desire to go into space? A personal question. You write so much about it. You are so hopeful that we will colonize space within the next 100 years. Personally, do you want to go there?
No, no, I'm a signpost. I point the way. I don't go anywhere. I mean, I don't even have this urge to go into an airplane or to see Grand Canyon or anything. As a matter of fact, I'm a Manhattanite. I'm not only a Manhattanite, but deep down within me, I feel that I don't want to be anywhere but Manhattan. Occasionally I leave Manhattan, but it's never voluntarily.
Do you work as well in other places as you work in Manhattan?
Oh, sure. I spent 21 years in the Boston area.
Right.
Rode away there. And whenever I go on a trip, if I have if I have time to myself, I manage to do something or other.
Let me take a break for a commercial. We're going to get into robots, UFOs, and a few other interesting things with some special phone calls. We'll start them in the next segment. We'll be right back with Isaac Asimov. Our special guest today on Monday, our conversation with, is Dr. Isaac Asimov, who is proudly sitting in a chair and also proudly sitting on the New York Times bestseller list because his new novel, Foundation's Edge, the fourth novel in the Foundation series, is currently in bookstores. I should point out that the Foundation trilogy won something called the Hugo Award as the all-time best science fiction series, which is a wonderful accomplishment, Isaac. Let me punch a button here on the phone. We've got some calls here. The first call is from Charles Seelig. Charles, welcome to our phone on Midday.
Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Charles, as I understand, you're a senior member of the Barnard Columbia Science Fiction Society. Is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Well,
been with it for 6 years.
Say hello to Dr. Isaac Asimov.
Hello, Dr. Asimov.
Hi.
Now, you wanted to ask a specific question, so fire away.
Yes. In some of your stories, Dr. Asimov, you have robots or computers guiding or outliving mankind. And I was wondering if that's just a storytelling device, or do you think that's eventually going to happen?
Well, if humanity continues on the road it's taking, it may come to an end before we've got robots that are intelligent enough to be able to continue on their own. But I certainly think that there's nothing unrealistic in supposing that the human race might, if it's sufficiently insane, commit suicide and leave behind their artifacts, more or less like the ancient Egyptians left behind the pyramids.
Well, I was thinking more in the last question type of story, where the computers outlive mankind because mankind just essentially evolves out.
Ah, well, you see, the last question was a very special story. In it, I tackled the problem of how far computers might evolve. And it seemed to me that there was no reason why a computer couldn't be eventually manufactured, which was as intelligent as a human being in its way. And if it could be as intelligent, it could be more intelligent. Well, how much more? And in the story, the computer evolved by stages until it was, quite literally, God. And then, of course, when the human species came to an end, they became one with God, so that the computer was left still alive. But then, of course, the computer began the whole thing over again by saying, "Let there be light." That's my favorite story of all those I've written.
In a related question, another of your robot stories, The Bicentennial Man, one of the things that happens in that story is that the robot adds human parts to himself, or parts that will let him become more human-like, and that also in this, humans are adding more artificial parts to themselves. And I was wondering, how do you think people's attitudes will change if they start having the ability to add artificial parts? Do you think, for instance, that they will not give up smoking because they know they can get another new lung even if the old one has cancer?
Well, that might be so. That might be so. Personally, what I always had in mind was that if robots became more human, you see, there's another possible ultimate end of robots. Instead of robots becoming God, robots become man, humanity. If robots become closer and closer to human beings, and if human beings themselves, through prosthetic devices, become closer and closer to being robots, the point may arise in which people will wonder what the distinction is between robots and human beings. And my own feeling is that the proper solution to such a dilemma would be, who cares?
Charles, I thank you for your call.
Okay, thank you. Good talking with you.
Interesting questions. Keep it going.
Okay, bye-bye.
Isaac, what are some of your thoughts about the new frontiers of medicine with regard to genetic engineering, improving the race, and some doctors putting themselves in the position of playing God?
Well, my own feeling is that the greatest advantage that human beings have is the variety of the gene pool. In other words, I don't feel that one type of gene, let us say, is superior to another type or more desirable. I think you can't really tell what is superior or more desirable because these things change with circumstances. And what's important is to have a lot of variety so that when circumstances do change, something which previously was not important and which now has become important is still there.
What would be an example of that?
Well, let me give you an example in grain. For instance, we're always looking for better strains of wheat, which will grow faster, which will produce more protein in a given period of time. And the result is that you may have something which is less resistant to disease, but you sacrifice that for the sake of getting fast growth and high protein content. And then everybody tries to grow that, so you end up with wheat, all of it belonging to the same strain or to a small group of strains, and all the other kinds of wheat, which you consider inferior, die out. And then if some disease does strike, some form of wheat rust, some fungus infection, towards which this particular strain has no resistance, suddenly it's the disease resistance that counts, not the high protein content. And you wipe out most of the wheat on Earth, and there's a starvation time, and you find you don't have the other strains handy to interbreed with these. Now, the same thing could happen to human beings. We're all going to be perhaps chosen in such a way that we've all enjoy living in cities, that we can all stand a great deal of population pressure, that we've got such stability under all this crowding, and you figure that's what you want. But then it turns out that the time comes when you want to spread out, when it will be better to live under non-concentrated conditions, and you find that nobody can do that. And so where are you going to get the strain? You want people who are tall, and there comes a time when you can use short people in spaceships, for instance. All you got are these tall, handsome guys like you.
Isaac, I found myself wondering this. I don't know why I was wondering, but I'm curious. If you, this is another personal question, hypothetically, could have lived at any other totally different time in history, when would that have been?
Oh, I've made up my mind. It's got to be right now, because
I knew you would say that, but if you could go back in any other time, the Egyptians, the Romans, the pioneers, the settlers, does any of it ever appeal to you, ever?
Oh, the tendency is to live in the golden age of Athens, so you can know Greek and hear Aeschylus's plays and Sophocles and Euripides in the original Greek when they're done. Attend the
opening night.
Right.
Yeah.
The only thing is, you know, the ancient Greek civilization was based on slavery, and a relatively small percentage of the population were true citizens. Most of the people were peasants, slaves, who didn't have much of a chance at education, and I have a feeling I go back there all set to chew the fat with Socrates, and I'd find I'm a slave working there on a farm or something.
Not a good deal.
No. So, and then wherever you go back, you know, you don't have antibiotics, you don't have anesthetics. What if you get appendicitis?
Not good.
Absolutely not.
What if you have a cavity?
That's right.
Not so good.
No, so I'm going to risk...
Now is the time.
Right, I'm going to risk nuclear war and everything and live now.
All right, let's take a break. We have another interesting phone call coming up. We're going to be talking about UFOs right after this. Wow. We're just talking about the settlers, and you were saying out of the first 11,000 settlers who settled...
Right, 11,000 people came to Virginia between 1607 and 1617, and in 1617 the population of Virginia was 1,000.
What was it? Disease, famine, wars?
All sorts of things. It was a hard life, and there were hard winters, and there was famine, and there was disease, and there was no reasonable method of fighting disease, and there were also troubles with the Indians who objected to...
the settlers. Anyway, let's not get sidetracked, because I think when people think of Isaac Asimov, in addition to the Shakespeare and mathematics books, they think about science fiction. So on the line right now, John P. Timmerman, National Chairman of the Center for UFO Studies. John, hello.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. Had any sightings recently, John?
Well, I haven't. I've never seen anything that I can't explain, but I've spoken to many, many people who have, and of course read the reports of others by the thousands.
Well, we have Dr. Isaac Asimov here, and you wanted to specifically ask a question. We prearranged this phone call, so fire away.
All right, fine. Well, I appreciate the opportunity, first of all, to be on your program, and of course to speak to Mr. Asimov. The question I have, sir, is regarding the many high-quality multiple witness reports of what appear to be unidentified objects or atmospheric phenomena, some of which leave measurable physical traces and which remain unexplained after careful examination by highly qualified persons. What do you believe should be done with this information, and by whom?
Well, I scarcely know. I presume that people who are interested in these phenomena study them.
They do, sir, to a great extent. Our problem, however, is that the information remains limited to those few who are intensely interested. Of course, I presume that's natural, and this is the way it probably will always be. But the implications of it are quite amazing, at least to those of us who spend a lot of time investigating these cases. And they seem to indicate that something immensely interesting and perhaps important has been occurring and continues to occur worldwide to a great variety of unpredictable witnesses.
In the 1920s and 1930s, there were a few people who were intensely interested in the phenomena of nuclear physics, of these little particles in the nucleus, etc., etc.
Yes.
There could not have been more than a few dozen people who were so intensely interested and who worked at it. The rest of the world would occasionally hear some stories about atom smashing, etc., but they weren't really interested, and they went their own way until such time as the nuclear bomb was exploded. And then suddenly everybody was interested. Now, presumably, if those people investigating UFOs come up with something startling, then everyone will be interested. But to expect worldwide serious scientific interest in advance of anything happening is perhaps to ask too much of human nature.
That's perhaps very true, sir. I wonder what you would regard as the dimensions of such an event. How would you describe such an event and its public revelation that would initiate such a reaction in the scientific community?
Landing at City Hall. That would be one example.
In which city, sir?
Well, actually, what most people would think of would be the actual landing of an extraterrestrial spaceship and the identification of its crew beyond any question. You know, take me to your leader, and he's brought over to the leader, whoever he is.
They're on television, they're interviewed,
Right.
Barbara Walters has, you know, the works.
But we don't have to go that far. I mean, the chances of there being an extraterrestrial extraterrestrial-themed spaceship is perhaps small.
Yes.
If, as a result of some UFO sighting, one suddenly understands something about the weather, for instance, which had never before been understood, if under certain conditions of temperature, barometric pressure, wind, etc.,
Yes.
one could get a glow which one wouldn't get otherwise. That, too, might suddenly arouse intense interest in meteorologists, and this is what J. Allen Hynek, for instance, talks about.
Yes.
I mean, he discounts the possibility of extraterrestrials, but does say that if we study UFO reports, we might make a quantum jump in our understanding of the atmosphere, perhaps of the Earth as a whole, perhaps of physics as a whole. Well, if Hynek can come up with something, I think science would follow him gladly, but I'm afraid that in 20 years he hasn't.
I understand, and I work intimately with Dr. Hynek. I assist him in his work at the Center for UFO Studies in Evanston, Illinois. And in his residence, we have in file some 80,000 cases of very interesting reports, many of which have been explained, but a significant number remain unexplained, and it's difficult to know, perhaps, the proper way to approach the scientific community to get their response on this. Peter Sturrock, you may recognize that name, at the Stanford Plasma Research Laboratories has recently organized a group of 100 scientists throughout the country who are willing to assist him in the examination of a variety of unexplained things, including the UFO phenomenon. And
Well,
I hope that they are able to come up with something useful.
I hope they come up with something, too.
Thank you, Mr. Timmerman.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Interest always, it's always a fascinating subject, isn't it?
Well, we appreciate your interest in our subject.
Well, good, thank you. Isaac, if you, either way the answer to this next question is interesting. Are we alone in the universe, or do you think that somewhere out there we've...
Well, there's two ways to look at it.
Yeah.
There are so many stars with so many planets, possibly, that it seems unlikely that there wouldn't be many planets that are quite like the Earth, chemically and physically. And if there are, it seems that it's unlikely that life wouldn't develop there. Life isn't so unusual phenomenon, it might seem. So statistically alone, you might think there are many planets that are life-bearing. Question is, how many of them would develop intelligence? We don't know. But the optimistic view, which is one I have in my time taken, is that there could be millions of civilizations just in our own galaxy, let alone other galaxies. On the other hand, there's also a pessimistic way of looking at it. In other words, when one tries to figure out the small changes that would make Earth uninhabitable, a little closer to the sun, a little further from the sun, slightly different atmosphere, and so on, and then you multiply all the chances of everything being just so, it turns out that maybe it's like one per galaxy or less. And you say, well, what incredible luck that we happen to be on this planet. That's not luck. This is the only planet we could be on, you see?
Sure.
That's called the anthropic principle. And therefore, we can argue either way, that we are alone or nearly alone, or that we're one of a huge crowd, and what we really need is evidence. And we don't have it either way so far.
What do you think? Well, it's almost too complicated, what we just went through with Mr. Timmerman there. Have you ever seen anything that you would say would be an unidentified flying object personally?
I once saw something which I couldn't understand. It was just a round, it looked like an aluminum sphere, featureless aluminum sphere hanging not far above my head in the twilight sky over near Walden Pond in Massachusetts. And I watched it in disbelief. It was just hanging there. And then slowly started changing shape. And I realized it was turning. And when it turned broadside, I saw it was a Goodyear blimp.
Really?
Really.
Oh, what a story.
And that's the closest I came to. I just happened to see it edge on. And, you know, if I had rushed in.
For a moment or two, if you had
rushed in and called up.
Or taken a picture.
All right. To this day, I'd have been convinced I'd seen a flying saucer.
Waited. Being a scientist, you waited just...
Actually, I waited because I was paralyzed. I couldn't believe.
Well, I've never seen anything, but it is really a fascinating subject. What did you think of the movie E.T.?
Well, I enjoyed it a lot, especially for the sympathetic portrayal of an extraterrestrial, you know, because I've grown so tired of having everything that is intelligent but not human made to look like a monster of evil. I mean, as far as I know, the only monsters of evil in the universe are us. So why are we always putting it on somebody else? Right. However, I must say that I'm old-fashioned, and I love to hear dialogue. When someone is speaking, I hate to hear other people speaking over
overlapping dialogue, improvisational sounding.
And you know, that's not naturalistic. It's supposed to be naturalistic, it isn't. But when you're in an actual crowd and there's overlapping dialogue, you're looking at the person you're speaking to.
And you're still getting it.
Right. You see his lips move, you pick up, and you don't hear the others. You hear only this one. But in the movies, when there's overlapping dialogue, you don't hear a thing.
Very good point.
I resent it.
Very good point. That's interesting. I wish you hadn't told me that, because now it's going to bother me more than it has.
Good.
We'll be back right after this. Another phone call about, well, you'll see, planets, right after this. All right, we have one other phone call from... are you on the line now?
I am.
Hi, Aaron Medlicott, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And you're with the Space Studies Institute?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, Dr. Isaac Asimov is here, and I understand you have a question about planetary chauvinism?
Yes.
Explain what it is, please.
Okay. As far as I know, planetary chauvinism is a phrase that Dr. Asimov coined, and I believe that that humans have a notion that we'll always have to spend out our lives on a planet. And my question is, for Dr. Asimov, don't you think it's possible we'll grow out of that chauvinistic thinking, or do you really believe we'll never have the smarts to spend out our lives in a new environment like a space colony?
No, I think we will grow out of it, but before I go any further, I have very reluctantly to deny being the originator of the expression. I wish I were, but I heard it from Carl Sagan.
Aha, okay.
Now, I won't swear that he invented it, but that's the first I came across.
That's a footnote.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, I'm convinced that we will build space settlements in space. We will live inside small worlds, and we will eventually recognize that as the natural way to live. It's economical. You have just a relatively small amount of mass, and it's all used. In the case of the Earth, you've got an enormous mass, and almost all of it is not used. It's down deep where we can't get at it, and the only purpose is to supply enough mass to produce enough gravitational intensity to hold the stuck onto the outside. And that's a waste. So that with the same mass, you can build 1 trillion space stations carrying incredible numbers of people inside. And this is what we'll eventually come to, I'm sure. We'll use the asteroid belt to build any number, thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of space stations, which will eventually flee the solar system altogether.
But if we are, let me stay on the line, if we will, Aaron, but if we are hypothetically and hopefully at zero population growth here on the planet, what's the incentive to go and do what you've just described? Is it just man's need to explore the unknown? It won't be a practical incentive, will it, Isaac?
Well, on the one hand, you can build a new life for yourself. Just as some people from Europe came to the Americas to look for gold, you know, but there are others who came to build a new life where they could live according to their own way without having to be to undergo, let us say, religious or cultural persecution. In the same way, if you go out there and you build a small world for yourself that holds 10,000 people, they might be all 10,000 Seventh-day Adventists who can now celebrate Saturday as the day of rest while having all these Sunday people around, squeezing them out. Or there can people be there who are secular humanists, and they don't want all this religion around, so they just live there, just a group of agnostics.
A colony of agnostics.
Yes, and you can have such a variety in human culture.
You want to interject something here, Aaron?
I was just going to say, so then, Dr. Asimov, you agree with Dr. Gerard O'Neill, who has been talking a lot about building space colonies, and you agree with him that it is feasible?
Oh, yes. He converted me, because when I read his first article on the subject, I was all set to dig in my heels and say, never, never, I want a colony on the moon. And, but I read it, and he convinced me, and I was so relieved he convinced me, because I'm always worried that I'm reaching the age where I'm set in my ways and can't accept any new ideas. Every time a new idea is forced on me, I'm so relieved. And of course, it means you have new ideas for science fiction stories. Now, I can write a science fiction story about somebody who wants to start a colony on the moon, and everyone's against it. We don't start colonies on worlds. We build them in space, you see.
In space, sure. All right, Aaron?
That sounds great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Did any jokes pop in, by the way, Isaac? If not, we can continue.
I never thought of it.
No, it's a I'm sure before the end of the show.
But as long as we're talking, I'll tell you a joke.
All right.
At the time that America sent people to the moon, an American said to an Israeli, "How do you like the fact that we have sent astronauts to the moon?" And the Israeli said, "Nothing, nothing. We in Israel are going to send astronauts to the sun." America said, "That's mad. You can't send astronauts to the sun. The heat, the light, the radiation, it's impossible." "Nonsense," said the Israeli. we're going to send them at night.
See, we don't have an audience today. That's why we didn't have gales of laughter.
Also, you say, I haven't known, this might be viewed as poking fun at the Israelis, but since I'm Jewish, I'm allowed to.
Then you're allowed to do it. You know, I heard one, but it involves two different religions. I think it's okay to say that Pope has an aide who rushes into him, says, Your Holiness, I've got good news and I've got bad news. The Pope says, let me have the good news first. The aide says, Christ has returned to earth. Pope's eyes widen. He says, well, what can the bad news be? The aide says, he's living in Salt Lake City.
See, to a Mormon, that'd be two pieces of good news.
Anyway, let's take a break. We'll come back with Isaac Asimov right after this. Well, this has been a real treat, I think, talking with Dr. Isaac Asimov, author of Foundation's Edge, published by Doubleday. Just in a couple minutes we have remaining here, I want to ask you two questions. The first is, what do you think happens at the time of death?
Oh, absolutely nothing. Well, when I say absolutely nothing, what I mean is that the organization of the body is disrupted, and you no longer exist. The materials of the body still exist, but the organization that resulted in what we call life doesn't exist. It's like building a complex palace out of little blocks. And there's the palace built up of blocks. And if you go like that and knock it down, all the blocks are still there. But the palace isn't.
The organization. Yeah. Isaac, what about the soul? Is there a soul? Does anything continue to survive us? Do you believe in reincarnation? Do you believe in heaven and hell? Or do you think that when we're dead?
There's no evidence of any of that. People who do believe it merely cite the Bible as evidence, and the Bible is not evidence in the scientific sense. Of scientific evidence, there isn't any. So I say, who knows? My own personal guess, based on no evidence, is that none of this exists. But someone else might guess, based on no evidence, that it does exist. Do whatever you're more comfortable with. Once evidence arises one way or the other, then we are no longer able to choose either one. We have to go with the evidence is. But so far, there isn't any.
The last very important question is, Isaac, do you watch Star Trek?
I've watched Star Trek plenty of times, yes.
Do you like it?
Oh, sure. Who wouldn't?
What are the other things in the science fiction field that you are a fan of? So many people are your fans who are science fiction nuts. What do you like to read and watch?
Well, I loved Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, and I'm waiting for the third one in the series. In fact, when I saw Empire Strikes Back, when it was finished, I stood up my seat and shouted, "Start number 3!"
You loved it that much?
Yeah.
So there's still a part of Isaac Asimov who was a little kid in his father's candy store in Brooklyn that's as much of a fan of science fiction, reading those books sitting on the floor.
Sure.
As ever, huh?
Sure. A lot of it's been spoiled by the fact that I write it and it's become a profession. But every once in a while, I get that little sense of wonder and awe.
What if your father hadn't had a candy store with those science fiction books?
That fills me with dread. I would never have been able to read science fiction. The only reason I was able to read it was because I could read it for nothing. We had no money, really, no money. And unless I could read it for nothing and put it back on the stands, I simply would not have been able to read it. What would have become of me, Bill?
Isaac?
It's frightening.
We have no evidence to give us
any
insight into that, but
You're
we have
right.
262 books to tell us what you've done, and this is the most recent, Foundation's Edge. This is a true treat having you with us. Thank you for coming, Dr. Isaac Asimov.
Thank you, Bill, for having me.
We will see you tomorrow on Midday. Have a nice afternoon.